Hello. Hi, an interactive group. That's great for a Friday. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the people who are tuning in via the webcast. I'm Ann Bowser. I'm the Director of Innovation here at the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is a unique institution. We were chartered by Congress in 1968 as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who is the only president with a PhD to date. Our mission is to help tackle global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the public policy community. This makes us a unique private-public partnership. On the public side, congressional appropriations through the Smithsonian ensure that our role as a presidential memorial is preserved. But much of our work is also supported by government agencies directly, by private foundations, and through the generosity of corporate partners and individuals. Our role as a boundary-spanning organization means that we work with and are accountable to both the public sector and also private sector, NGO, and other communities. From my personal perspective, some of our most fulfilling work over the years has involved working with federal agencies on crowdsourcing and citizen science. About 5 years ago, we brought together a range of people from the federal community with citizen science practitioners from universities, researchers from NGOs, nonprofits, et cetera, for a roundtable that we called New Visions in Citizen Science. The event kicked off our work program for understanding how federal agencies could engage and help support citizen science and crowdsourcing as still relatively novel means of open innovation. It helped seed a series of convenings that became the federal community of practice for crowdsourcing and citizen science's monthly meetings. And CCS is here today as our co-hosts for the event. Since 2013, we've worked with CCS on a number of projects, including designing some citizenscience.gov resources. And we've come a long way. I was looking at the New Visions event page this morning, and some of the questions that we asked were really low in complexity compared to the issue of scale that we're thinking about today. I'll let Rhiannon Gordon, a longtime CCS leader who has also collaborated with the Wilson Center through the Federal Games Guild, tell you a little bit more about that. But first, I have to say a few things about technology. As fitting for a citizen science and crowdsourcing event, we are piloting the use of the Menti platform to get your submissions via mobile phone on a number of questions, including 3 initial icebreakers. I'm also encouraging you all to tweet with the hashtag #SitSciScales. So phones are broadly permitted and encouraged at this event. So thank you again for coming, and Rhiannon, please join me on the stage.
Hello, I'm Rhiannon Gordon. As Ann said, I'm a longtime member of the steering committee for the Federal Community of Practice for Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science. In 2012, a group of us started getting together very informally, just sitting around a table downstairs talking about citizen science and what it was and what we wanted to do with it. At the time, there were probably more words in our name than there were actually regularly people at the meeting. 5 years ago, we sort of dipped our toe into the public for the first time, partnering with the Wilson Center at the New Visions for Citizen Science event. And from there, we made ourselves just a bit more formal as what was still essentially a grassroots group of federal practitioners, federal employees, contractors, fellows, anyone else who was working with a federal agency to fund or carry out citizen science, or who was just interested in learning a little more about it and maybe how to pitch it to their leadership. Over the course of the last 5 years, we've grown from that lunch table to a group of almost 400 members representing 62 different federal organizations. And we've remained relatively informal. There's nothing that says that we absolutely must be there meeting every month, except the fact that we want to, and we want to network and learn more about how to make our projects better for the federal missions and for the public who make use of them. Last year, we were a finalist for the Harvard Ash Award for Innovations in Government, and the finalist status came with a small monetary prize that was meant to go towards efforts to scale and share lessons. That's a relatively straightforward thing if we represented a single project at a single scale that was ready to reach out to new locations or larger ones. But as a group that is already primarily for networking, multiple projects at every scale from classrooms to the entire world and occasionally beyond it, we started talking about what does it really mean to scale? What would it mean for us to scale? What does it mean for others? Is bigger always better? And why do we pick the scales that we pick? And those conversations ultimately grew into this event that is intended to explore them in a little more depth. So we hope that you'll enjoy that conversation. We hope that you will participate in it here in the room, on Menti, and through Twitter. We'll be collecting questions through both of those. And I'm sure you'll see a little, we are still a relatively experimental group. We like to try new things. We like to try new things in front of rooms of 100 people who've just met us. And we hope and frequently do pull it off. So if you are interested in learning more about the Federal Community of Practice, you can visit us at citizenscience.gov, where you'll find more information about our community, as well as the toolkit for federal practitioners that we've developed, a database of federal projects, and other resources. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy the afternoon.
Now I have the pleasure of briefly introducing Karen Cooper. Karen is an associate professor at the North Carolina State University and part of an interdisciplinary team of faculty in the Chancellor's Faculty Excellence Program in Leadership and Public Science. She is the author of Citizen Science: How Ordinary People Are Changing the Face of Discovery. Prior to her faculty appointment, she worked for almost 15 years at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where she has published research with citizen science data, including NestWatch, Project FeederWatch, Christmas Bird Count, Reading Bird Survey, and My Yard Counts, and helped to design citizen science projects including YardMap, NestWatch, and Celebrate Urban Birds. Karen's current citizen science projects include Sparrow Swap, Sound Around Town, and Crowd the Tap. I've had the pleasure of working with her in a number of capacities over the years, most recently on the board of the Citizen Science Association. Karen also co-chairs a co-dated WDS task group on citizen science and the validation, curation, and management of crowdsourced data. It's a mouthful. And I had the pleasure of actually going down and spending time with her in Raleigh for 2 weeks as we did some research related to the state of the data in citizen science. I think what inspires me the most about Karen is that she's really good at using citizen science data, publishing on it, especially, her formal bio calls out her work from Cornell. But she is also an innovator who is pushing the boundaries of how we work as a field and who we partner with and the types of problems that we engage with and how. So Karen, I'm excited to hear about your work today.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm super excited about this event, about talking about scale. I'm particularly excited because I mean, although there might be some people here new to citizen science, I think that for the most part, who we have gathered here are people already really familiar, invested in citizen science. And so we're really ready to have conversations that talk about taking it to the next level. I think we know that citizen science is real science, that citizen science, produces scientific discoveries that would otherwise not be possible. We know that citizen science can engage thousands, tens of thousands of people in really small tasks that collectively have impact, right? Small tasks that by themselves maybe wouldn't matter, but together they do, like voting. We know that citizen science can engage communities in the scientific process from start to finish and produce actionable knowledge that people take to the courts, that people help leverage, for regulatory enforcement. We know citizen science isn't even new, and that it's even been the birth of different fields like oceanography, right? Because how else could we have gotten a grasp on the oceans except for crowdsourcing from sailors? So I think a lot of us are familiar with that citizen science comes in many different forms, many different styles, and and that a lot of those differences involve scale. And so anyway, I'm super excited that we're here today to really take that conversation about scale to the next level. And I'll start just talking a little bit about my lab. I have 3 citizen science projects. These are my grad students on the projects, and these are all at different scales. Just briefly, Sound Around Town, which is in partnership with the National Park Service, takes place right now in Raleigh with the intention of scaling and replicating in different cities. And it's right now is what's called a mentored citizen science project. And that term was I think coined with the Smithsonian project here, this neighborhood nest watch, where scientists go to backyards to ban birds. And it's the same kind of thing with Sound Around Town. This is Carson, and she goes to backyards to deploy this sound recording equipment from the Park Service. And then volunteers do standardized listening sessions where they log anthropogenic and natural sounds that they hear coinciding with this. And the other way we hope to scale it is if we can get that instrumentation a little bit simpler so that we can loan it out through libraries. Sparrow Swap, that is Suzanne, on that project is a national project, right? So the spatial extent is really large, but it's very coarse coverage, meaning there's not that many participants for that space, right? So there's about 200 participants across the country. It's a very specialized community of interest that we work with of bluebirders. But they do a lot and provide a lot of data. And our advisory board for that project is comprised of citizen science volunteers who really help us design our protocols, and co-design those with our community. And then launching just in the new year is Crowd the Tap, and that's Amani on this EPA-funded project. And that's to inventory plumbing on private property, right? The service line and the premise plumbing, home plumbing, in a project related to modeling risk of lead in tap water. And that's the one that so it'll be a national inventory. And so we're really grappling with issues of scale and how to scale that, right? And there's not already, infrastructure hobbyists out there that we can tap, who are really into pipes. So, we're thinking about who our partners are, how we're going to reach different people, and how, just basically how that's going to work. So some of the things I'm going to talk about with scale are things that we're thinking about with Crowd the Tap. So just the ecologist in me, we'll start with scale, right? And so in ecology language, scale is basically if we distill it, it's really about grain or like the resolution of the data and the extent, right? So how fine scale, and this can be spatial or temporal, right? So your resolution, you can have high density of sampling spatially, or like high frequency sampling temporally. And then extent-wise, you can have large spatial area, or long time frames. And what citizen science, especially contributory style citizen science, is so powerful at is decreasing the grain and increasing the extent. And those two things that's why it can produce discoveries that scientists can't do alone, because it can change the scale in this way. But how does that happen? And how do we do that? And I think, I think that right now, we actually don't really know. I don't think we know sort of what the different types of networks look like that are effective in scaling in citizen science. And I hope that some of our discussion will center on that. I know that like back when Thomas Jefferson was penning the Constitution, he had started a plan for weather monitoring, and he wanted to scale that by deputizing one person in every county, right? So it was a very centralized system that he envisioned where everybody would send data back. That didn't come to fruition with him, but of course it later kind of is the National Cooperative Weather Observer Network, which is very centralized in that way. And they have a certain resolution of sampling. And then we also have CoCoRaHS, right, which are people putting out precipitation devices, which is also fairly centralized, but it has a bit of decentralization in it too, because every sort of local network has someone in person who can help face to face when people need assistance, you know, with their monitoring or with the computer or whatever. And I think distributed, I'm not even going to go there, whatever, with cloud stuff. So, you know, and I think sometimes we look at projects and we might assume one thing, like you might look at eBird, right, iconic project, and say, oh, it's very centralized because all the data are going back to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. But if you think about why it's successful, eBird isn't necessarily training all those birders, right? There's bird clubs and Audubon groups in almost every town bringing up those birders. It has a decentralized component of all these different nodes that actually help facilitate that project. Anyway, so I think it's an interesting area to think about. One of the projects that I'm working on with Jacoby Wilson and our collaborators at NAACP is all about scaling with their network, kind of like to be what I guess Audubon is to birds, but to be that for environmental justice and environmental exposures. In this graph, it's just region 4 of EPA. And the dark circles are all the air quality EPA monitors. Across the country, I think there's about 4,000 of these stationary monitors the EPA has, you know, which is great, but it's not enough. And then the light circles are NAACP chapters, where not only could the chapter be deploying air quality sensors, but also members in that chapter, and then members who do outreach in their community and in different neighborhoods and with different constituents. So the potential for scaling, I think, through this sort of semi-centralized and semi-decentralized sort of node network, I suspect is really powerful. And because if some of these models are possible now because of our communication and internet technologies, but some are just like old-fashioned, right? So, and I think a lot of our citizen science started before, a lot of our scaled citizen science started before we had some of these communication technologies. Anyway, and here's an example from the Christmas bird count. How many people do we have birders here? I'm just curious. Yeah, okay, a lot of birders, excellent. And the way the Christmas bird count works, you know, which started in 1900, is that there's these circles, and in each circle is divided into sections, and each section has a coordinator, a section leader, and then each circle has a compiler. And then there's birders in all of those areas. And the birders report to their section leader, and then the section leader reports that to the compiler for that circle, and then the compiler reports it to the central office, right? And so it's this very nested level of structure that allowed scaling before there were the kind of technologies that we have today. That still might actually be a super productive type of scaling. I was going to give one example just from one of the things I'm working on now, which is this, what we're calling the Citizen Science Campus, and how we're going to scale it. Because there's we're starting at NC State, and there's over 5,000 colleges and universities that we could potentially scale to, and over 1,000 community colleges. So this is a program where at NC State, we want to have it be that undergraduates encounter or at least 5 citizen science opportunities throughout their time on campus. And those are curricular and co-curricular. And so in our curricular opportunities, this is both STEM courses and non-STEM. In fact, I'm most excited about our non-STEM courses. We have, for example, our English 101, which is our first-year writing program. It's required for all incoming first-year students. And we're piloting with that. They need, in that class, they are supposed to have a real-life experience and then write about. That's the substance of all the writing assignments. And what we're piloting is that experience is citizen science participation. We have lots of different co-curricular activities. There's a citizen science club that's super active. Our residential villages are are themed dormitories basically, and they do community service work. They want to do that in citizen science. Our libraries host what they call a Wolfpack Challenge, which is kind of a competitive citizen science event every year. In our regular dorms, we're putting out kits, citizen science kits in the vending machines, and sort of hot spots on campus that people might encounter, like at the bus stops, for engagement in citizen science. Anyway, and on the flip side of that, that means we have potentially tens of thousands of students on our campus engaged in citizen science. It's going to become a household word to them. And it means that our faculty then can start to scale their projects, that our campus then becomes an incubator for projects to work out the kinks on campus before scaling either to other campuses or beyond campus. And it's also a great ecosystem for studies of citizen science and learning. Anyway, we're doing that through the SciStarter platform, so it's just integrated with all of our other software, so students we use Shibboleth. It's like the credentialing system. They just use their email or whatever, they get into their SciStarter account, and it's these guided experiences in the things that are offered, and then on the back end, administratively and for research, we have all the metrics and can keep track of what's going on. Anyway, and that's SciStarter Higher Ed, which then can scale, like I said, to other colleges and universities. So those all things related to scaling data collection, right? But there's other things that might scale, which is really the scale of the impact, right? And it might not always coincide with the scale of data collection. So there's just a couple of examples so for example, in the UK, there's decades of data that has been collected on when birds breed, right? People who like to monitor bird nests. And in the late 90s, that led to publications related to that birds are breeding earlier because of climate change, right? That was a national scale study in the UK, but it was super critical to negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol, right? Which is one of the first climate change global treaties. And it was because it showed that climate change wasn't some future problem, right? It was already having impacts right now, back then, on birds and the timing of breeding. Sort of on the other extreme, there's folks in Tonawanda, that sounded funny to say, in upstate New York, who collected really it started with them collecting one air sample, right, with this bucket sampler that showed high levels of benzene. One sample led to a whole cascade of events that culminated with this fellow there being convicted in criminal court for polluting and spending 1 year in jail. So again, my main point here is that we can talk a lot about data collection over different scales, and it's not and then we should also be thinking about that doesn't mean that that's where the scale, the impact has to happen. The impact can always be larger or smaller. But anyway, I've kind of been talking about sort of the physical properties of networks or like how things scale. But of course, there's this other type of scale to consider, right? Justice scales. Because we're talking about people, right? It's not just data. It's not just, right? This is people and networks. And of course, we know that at different scales, the way people participate in citizen science, it has some fundamental differences, sort of in power dynamics, in intention and motivations, and even the types of knowledge that people want produced, right? A lot of community-based work, community-driven work wants actionable knowledge. A lot of the sort of larger contributory work is often focused on fundamental knowledge gain. And anyway, so I think it's important, to think about these kinds of components. And I guess this, I wasn't sure quite how to get into this, but for me, I think about sort of the constraints and limitations on scale. Because oftentimes when I talk to people, they're like, well, I want tons of people, thousands of people participating in every step of the scientific process for actionable knowledge and being empowered. And it's like, can we have it all? Or are there trade-offs? Are there not? Like, how does this different scale look? And this is supposed to animate. None of my animations are going. But anyway, so sorry to take it in, start on the left. But so now if you'll bear with the physiologist in me and my back, there's a huge area, like there's basically two like fundamental unifying theories in ecology, and one is Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, and the other is scaling, and how that constrains what's possible. So this is just basically by analogy, but like water striders are tiny, okay? Like people can't walk on water, and Spider-Man's a superhero. And that's because of fundamental laws of physics, laws of chemistry, and laws of geometry, like literally constrain what's feasible and what's not. And I suspect a lot of that applies to social networks as well. But anyway, but just so you know, there's two ways things can scale in a biological sense anyway that I think is relatable. And one is isometric. So this is the typical example is like as salamanders grow, they stay in the same proportion. So their limbs and their body, everything is proportional. They just change in size. Okay, because that is the case, they stay in proportion, the form doesn't change, function has to change. So you get a large salamander, walks like this, frequency, plods along. A small one, like this. The frequency is just fundamentally different. It can't be conserved if the form is conserved. So you can see it with instruments too. They're all the same proportion, but simply because the size differs, the sound that comes out, the frequency is different, right? These are fundamental laws of scaling. If you wanted a small instrument to sound like a large one, you'd have to change the dimensions, the proportionality of that. Anyway, we grow allometrically because we need to preserve function. So the form has to look different so that we function the same way. That's why we have big-headed babies, okay? And so my point here, sorry to be long-winded with it, is that I think if we're gonna scale, so one of the things that I'm interested in collaboration with Dr. Jacoby Wilson is scale. How do we scale and take what's done and the fundamentals of community-based engagement in citizen science and scale that? And basically what we're realizing is that it's gonna look different because we wanna preserve a lot of those core principles. So we're gonna keep the function, the form is gonna be different. We need to find like that big-headed baby, okay? And so the way that we're doing that, and again, this was supposed to animate, is that we're starting with like the basic community-based recommendations, and these are pretty central and well-developed in the field of community-based citizen science, distilling them to like the basic core principles that we think are scalable. We're applying critical race theory to those to try to come up with sort of what the scaled version of that for contributory citizen science, what components it really needs to have in its design to still embody those core principles. And that's our work in progress. And it's one of the part of that crowd, the TAP work as well. And we think it's important because, because, we can see these benefits, right? Like with, I guess it's not going to animate, with, this is a map from eBird. But anyway, we can, because of the contributory citizen science in eBird, we can totally map like amazing distributions of birds. And we want to be able to do that for health exposures, right? So this map there for health exposures is derived from satellites. We need the on-the-ground monitoring to be able to do the same kind of thing. And so, again, and it's not to the exclusion of community-based citizen science, it's to complement and support community-based citizen science. So for example, community-based citizen science happens, in different spots, right? It happens, it's responsive to when there's a problem. And being responsive is great. But what we want to do is have a system that's also proactive, that is set up as scaffolding to support the community-based work. And that scaffolding is basically sort of large-scale contributory citizen science. So we want it to function across scales. And this also is nuts. It's supposed to animate, so I'm just going to ask this without people seeing it. So I guess I'm curious who is familiar with Garrett Hardin and the Tragedy of the Commons. Raise your hand. It's almost everyone in the room. Okay, right. So it kind of was this iconic thing. Sort of drew on some work from the 1700s about the commons, and is often talked about in a very local scale about the pastures and like too much overgrazing on common pastures. And his solution, he also pointed out though that also things like air and water are also common pool resources that we share. But anyway, his solution that he suggested was, if it can be fenced, fence it. and privatize. If it can't be fenced, then have laws and sanctions, okay? And then he went on to say that really to avert the tragedy of the commons, what we need to do is have a new morality that basically goes directly against the UN Convention on Human Rights, right? Because that says people have a right to family planning, to choose their family size. And he said, no, they don't. Anyway, so that was Hardin's approach, right? Which is everyone learns. Okay, so how many people have heard of Elinor Ostrom? Raise your hand. Okay, so much, much fewer, right? So Elinor Ostrom proposed solutions to the tragedy of the commons that really she brought in studies of human behavior into studies of governance and economics and studies of collective action. And her approach was very much about respecting local knowledge. She would say, well, bureaucrats can't really decide these things. It needs local knowledge, local input, and to value those kind of things, and to work across multiple scales. So like, for example, in fisheries, the Hardin approach is to say, here's quotas on fish. Everybody owns different fish. It's kind of like fencing it up. And her approach is really what is supporting sort of co-management in fisheries. And they produce very different results. Guess which one won the Nobel Prize for their work? Okay, so Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for her work in these solutions to the tragedy of the commons. But for some reason, it's just not as out there. But I encourage everyone in citizen science to get familiar with her work. It's so applicable. And when she was asked about global climate change, so this is them. Anyway, when she was asked about global climate change, right, because she's very much always talking about the importance of local scales and different scales, she said, well, yes, it's a global problem, but it's not going to be solved only by working at a global scale. It really is important to work at multiple scales. And so she has this polycentric model of governance that involves coordination and whatnot up and down scales. And I think that's sort of a vision that we can take in to citizen science. And then she kind of also, it became sort of that little, whatever, mantra or whatever, it's cliche now, whatever, but it's so true. And I think, anyway, I think it can help our conversations. So anyway, I hope that some of these thoughts can help us in just think more broadly and differently about the implications of scale and scaling in citizen science. And I really look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Awesome. I'm Allison Parker. I am a researcher here at the Wilson Center, and also a long-time member of the steering committee. What do you think? Is 3 years a long time? I guess relative, right? Of the steering committee of the crowdsourcing the Federal Community and Practice for Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science. So I bring both those perspectives. I'd like to introduce our first panel. So if panel 1 could come on up. And as they're coming up, we're going to go back in the agenda a little bit to the icebreaker questions that weren't quite working right at the beginning, but everything seems to be good now. One more slide. Okay, so those of you that were able to access the menti.com and enter the code, which is there at the top of the screen now, and enter in where you live. Looks like we got a lot of Maryland representatives, even more than DC. Interesting. What topic gets you most excited by a citizen science or crowdsourcing project? Conservation, as well as a variety of other topics. Excellent. What celebrity would you most like to see involved in a citizen science project? These are great. A lot of Michelle Obama. Excellent. Okay, so if you missed it so far, menti.com, you don't need to download anything. You can just access it by typing in this code 496945, and there will be additional opportunities for crowd participation throughout the agenda. All right. Did everybody get Allison Bree? Whoa. The guys from Queer Eye. So we will keep moving, but we can come back to this at the end. All right, so I'd like to introduce panel 1, and the topic of this panel is the benefits of cross-scale sharing. So we will do short presentations by each of the panelists and then move pretty quickly to discussion, and you all will have opportunities to ask questions. You can ask questions through the Menti platform or through Twitter using the hashtag #SitSciScales. But we will also ask you in person if you have questions that you'd like to ask directly. So we'll start with Lynn Wigbels, who is the international coordinator of the GLOBE program. Her involvement in GLOBE began over 20 years ago when she was at NASA, and then rejoined the GLOBE program in 2014 as international coordinator, and I'll let her tell you all about that.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask, how many of you have heard of GLOBE? And how many of you have participated or been involved in GLOBE? Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit quickly to start with where we are in GLOBE, because a lot of you know about it. We are an international science and education program. We connect students, teachers, citizen scientists, and scientists to better understand, sustain, and improve Earth's environment at local, regional, and global scales. NASA is the supporter of the program. I'm sorry, NASA is the sponsor of the program, and it's supported by NOAA, NSF, and the Department of State. The program was announced in 1994, and it was the implementation began in 1995. Since that time, millions of students in more than 33,000 schools in 121 countries have participated. Now, we did start out as a K through 12 program with some undergraduate involvement, but a few years ago, we extended it to include citizen scientists of all ages. And actually, a lot of the impetus came from former GLOBE school students who graduated and said, we want to keep doing GLOBE. But it also was very consistent with what else was going on with citizen science. So since 1995, nearly 160 million measurements have been submitted to the GLOBE Science Database, which is available worldwide. And this provides data for student and professional scientific research. We operate in 4 GLOBE spheres. We have protocols for atmosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, and pedosphere. I think we have over 55 protocols. So we have the ability to be looking at Earth as a system. And what the GLOBE program does is provide the science, education, and technology resources that were developed by scientists and educators. Slide 2. Do I just do that? Okay. So what I really want to focus on is how GLOBE is implemented and how we work across these scales. And so when we began the program in 1994, we basically invited all the countries of the world to participate in the program. And the way countries join GLOBE is to sign agreements with NASA. In these agreements, we provide substantial flexibility for how these countries implement GLOBE. There are a few items in there that are very important to ensure the scientific validity of the data, following the protocols that were developed by scientists, using instruments that meet the specs that were defined by the scientists, having a GLOBE-trained teacher in schools to guide the students. But other than that, the countries decide how they want to implement it. They decide the scale. They decide how many schools. And they are financially and managerially responsible for implementing it. And this means that they decide what focus they want, or if they delegate that to the schools and the local level. And it happens both ways. In some countries, they do a direct correlation with the curriculum, but in other countries, it's actually delegated to the locals and the schools. Countries name a country coordinator. So that is their responsibility. They're either in the government or in an NGO, and they're responsible for day-to-day implementation. And I wanted to highlight that what we've seen over the years is that GLOBE has been implemented across a variety of disciplines. Obviously science, the education, environment, technology, but also geography, language, arts, and music. So we've seen it all, and it's just provided a platform, much to the teacher's imagination, to figure out how they want to implement it. And I want to make a point that in the U.S., it is a similar model. We have a country coordinator in the U.S., and then we have U.S. partners, and again, it's up to them to decide how they're going to implement the program. So what do we do? Because implementation is really defined and led by the community, what we try to do, we strive to meet their needs through common platforms, providing bridges, coaching, opportunities for collaboration and sharing strategies, best practice, and finding connections. The things that we can do to help them in their implementation. So we have a GLOBE implementation office at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. In the beginning, it also pretty much managed the international part, and when I say managed, was responsible for communicating and supporting and whatever. Over a decade ago, we established regional offices. The regional offices are managed by community members from the regions. Several of them are former country coordinators, or they came from the country coordinator organizations in their countries. So they were very familiar with how to implement the program, how to apply it in different ways, and they know the country coordinators in the region. We have annual international meetings. We at the GIO, Global Implementation Office, put on an annual meeting, and the regional offices have annual regional meetings. And these are opportunities for the country coordinators to come together at a global level or at a regional level to share the results of what they're doing, the activities that they're undertaking, and to plan collaboration and future activities. And we also provide some training during those meetings. We also have GLOBE Learning Expeditions. We've had 6 since the beginning of the program, and while it is for the global community to come together, it really focuses on students. And so it's an opportunity for students to come and give presentations on their research, as well as participate in a field experience. Just this past summer, we were in Mount Killarney National Park in Ireland, and they were able to have this experience with park rangers there. So it's an opportunity for them to get to know their local, the local environment of where they're going while they're meeting their counterparts from around the world. We also have an International Virtual Science Symposium on an annual basis, and this provides that global opportunity for students to share their research, particularly during the years when we don't have that global learning expedition. And again, they do research, they provide reports, they have an opportunity to interact with mentors, they get some feedback. We do have some judging of that, and the reports that meet certain criteria, those students are eligible for stipends to attend the annual meeting or the GLOBE Learning Expedition. We also have a GLOBE International STEM Network, and these are professionals that work with schools. We've got approximately 430 around the world. The relationship with the schools is determined by the schools and the STEM member. They visit schools, they mentor the students, sometimes they work on a campaign with the students. So another opportunity for them to connect. We established GLOBE working groups a few years ago, an opportunity for the GLOBE community to provide input to shape the future of the GLOBE program. Based on their experience, what do they need? And it's also a forum for them to have dialogue and interaction. The other thing we do, a lot of the research that's done by the students is done, by the teachers locally at the school. But there's also a real interest in doing measurement campaigns at the global level, regional level, and sometimes, between 2 nations. Because the GLOBE students really want to have an opportunity to work with their counterparts around the world. That is one of the strong draws of the program. And so we have connections with satellite missions where the GLOBE students can collaborate with the mission teams. They can collect data that those teams use to compare with the satellite data. We have global field measurement campaigns, and then there are regional field membership campaigns. So, for example, an ENSO campaign at the global level, European phenology campaign in Europe. There are also regional expeditions. Recent one was in Lake Pokhara in Nepal, where several countries, teachers and students came together and did measurements around the lake. There's also things like Globe Gains at the national level. So many of the countries bring the students together, again, to have a kind of a multi-day field experience, and also student competitions, so that the students can, at a national level, come together and share their research with their counterparts. We recently initiated the Globe Zika Education and Prevention Project, and this is in collaboration with the Department of State, and this involves schools and organizations in 3 regions to help increase the understanding of how Zika is transmitted, what's the source, and to educate how you can eliminate that source. We're creating connections with public health officials, and then the data that they're collecting on the mosquitoes that they are finding as mosquito larvae is then put in the database, so it's crowdsourced data. Just a couple more points. We do look for partnerships with other organizations where we have an alignment of objectives, and so Peace Corps has been collaborating in Globe at the country level for many, many years. We recently signed an agreement, NASA, with Peace Corps to kind of formalize and expand that. Eco schools, there's a lot of alignment. We monitor, they take action, and so the schools, inside the school, the 2 programs mesh very well. But these are the kinds of things that we provide as opportunities if the countries want to take it on. Globe partners and schools make their own connections. There was students in Thailand. They had a problem with the dengue fever, and the community thought it was the water, the fish ponds, which is their livelihood. And so they went and looked at the fish ponds, and they also looked at the water sources around the homes, and they determined that it wasn't the fish ponds, but it was actually sources around the home. That's a wonderful example of how Globe schools can work at the local level. They also reach out to research organizations and networks, and I know in Europe, the European country coordinators have submitted several proposals over the years to the European Union to get some funding to do some collaborative Globe activities, and they've received several of those. And just the final point I'll make is with these new technologies of mobile devices and apps, we now have a data entry app and, of course, the Globe Observer app. This has enabled many more people of the Globe Observer app to become part of the Globe community, and made it easy for students to go out and do these activities in the field and enter the data immediately. So these are just some thoughts. Thank you.
All right. Next, we will hear from Jeff Herrick, who is a research soil scientist for the USDA at the Agricultural Research Service in Las Cruces, New Mexico. So we're looking forward to hearing from him about a global land potential knowledge system called Land PKS.
Great, thanks, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. I will admit that when we started this project, we did not think of it as a citizen science project, because I always thought of citizen science as being something where citizens provide data to scientists. And what we were trying to do was develop a system where citizens could use science to make better decisions about their land and how to manage their land, could access science, could collect data, could interpret that data, could connect to others who are managing similar types of land in other parts of the world and learn from them. So the concept of land potential, the potential of the land in southern New Mexico is actually very similar to the potential of a lot of land in Namibia. And so if someone comes up with an incredible innovation in Namibia, someone in New Mexico should be able to access that knowledge instantly. And we now have the technology to do that. At the same time, someone in Brazil should be able to collect data about their land and interpret that data in the context of existing scientific knowledge without having to submit that to a scientist. And so we're trying to put as much as we can on the phone that will allow people to collect data without instruments that then allows them to unlock the vast repository of data, knowledge, and information that exists globally. That's the vision. We feel like we are starting to make some progress. What you're seeing here is actually a scrolling video of the results screen. I'm going to see if I can get the input screens to run as well. Only with Mac. Okay. Great. So if you'd like to see how this works, go ahead and since we've all got our phones out using Twitter and menti.com and everything else, you can download LandPKS. So just literally those letters. If you search on that on either iPhone or Android, download it. It will ask you for a Google login, and that's just so that you can then access your information. Once you've submitted it, it's available instantly on the portal. It is an open source and open data project. We will be, and it's interesting because it was funded initially by USAID and therefore open data. There's a huge amount of interest now in the United States among producers. Our producers are not as excited about sharing their data as folks are internationally necessarily. And so when we rebuild this app in React Native over the next year, we will be building in privacy functions as well. We'll be sort of working that balance between the value of big data and the value of sharing data and the need and or desire of people to not necessarily tell their neighbors, actually in the developing world, what they're more concerned about is telling the neighbors what their yields are. Whereas here, it's more how we're managing the land, what sorts of inputs we're using that people may find either concerning or an opportunity. Working with lots of different interests. It can be used offline. Obviously, you need to be online to download it and initially register. We will be, as we're rebuilding this thing, we'll be working to probably include a mode where you don't even have to log in, where you can use the app. Obviously, you can't upload your information because you'd have no way to access it, but where you can use the app to without any sort of identifying information going back. So we use it completely independently. We are working, there is a 7th grade curriculum that will be coming out that uses a part of the app, and that should become available probably by the late this spring, working with the Asombro Environmental Science Education Center in Las Cruces, New Mexico, which also works with a lot of NSF projects around the country. In the interest of time, I'm going to shift now to, we were asked to provide a couple of insights that we've learned about scaling. And I'm not sure if you can see that slide very well, but we have had people using the app on all of the populated continents throughout the world, and we have no idea who most of these people are. If you go to the data portal on landpotential.org, these points actually load in chronological order. And so what you'll see, if you zoom out to the global level, is that it initially sort of starts with these little clusters in Namibia and Kenya where we happen to be working. And then it starts to fan out around the globe as different people either picked it up by just downloading because they heard about it, or different organizations like the United Nations University group in Iceland starting to teach it through some of their programs. So lessons learned in the last minute or so here. Create value for as many types of users as possible, but keep it simple. This is a constant tension for us. Our two major user groups are not domestic and international. They're actually people using it in production mode, people using it for monitoring and evaluation or for land use planning, and those using it in a one-off mode, more for extension or farm management. Understand the user needs and explain, increase the value for them, okay? And so really listening to our users, and then instead of just saying, hey, here's our great app, saying, well, it sounds like some of your needs may be met by this particular module. So for example, for small farmers, keeping track of your management systems is really important. Your inputs, your yields, and so forth. And most of us, and I'm a small farmer, we have 2 acres of pecans in southern New Mexico. It is a commercial operation. It's very small. And I keep my records on my refrigerator, and I'm a scientist who has developed nationally adopted monitoring systems for the United States government. I'm pretty sure that I'm going to convince myself to use the app as soon as we get this land management module out, because it's only going to take me about 2 minutes per week. And I'm really excited about that. And I've got to have the conversation of the scientist has to have the conversation about the guy who's really tired when he gets home from work and goes out and prunes the trees and comes back, and I don't want to get on my app. Anyway, we'll see. It'll be interesting. Network widely, but don't try to cater to all. We engage and we would welcome. So those logos, we don't do MOUs unless you're going to give us money or we're going to give you money. And there are actually only 4 institutions we're doing that, 3 institutions we're doing that with right now. We have managed to partner with a very low overhead costs. And some of these partners are really significant. I mean, people are putting in major FTEs and working with this and doing training and so forth. I know I'm from the U.S. government, but I really am here to help and to reduce the administrative load associated with helping. So please, if you'd like to partner with us, if you feel like it would help you to have the logo up there and we feel like we have sort of common visions and goals, we're happy to cross-promote, and that's something we can do quite easily. And then lastly, I'm just going to point to the trend line. Compared to Globe, we've had a trivial uptake so far. However, our trend line looks pretty good. That's an R-squared of 0.985 on an exponential growth curve. We do expect to continue, actually, so we've doubled every year. We expect that to go to triple every year. So we expect in fact, next year it will almost certainly triple just based on what we know already. So with that, I'm going to close and leave time for discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff. Now we will hear from Mikkel Marin, the community team lead for Mapbox and also the co-founder of Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, about some of these initiatives. Thanks.
Hello, how are you? I'm Mikkel. I lead the community team at Mapbox. We help people who are making maps and using open data for social impact be successful. And big part of that is work in OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap is also a big part of our products. And I've been associated with the OpenStreetMap project since 2005, started in 2004, with a simple idea. How many people here are contributors to OpenStreetMap at any point in your past? A handful. We started with less people than are in this room, walking around with GPS units on roads, and the idea was simply to convince other people to do the same. They'd convince their friends, so on, and eventually we'd walk every road in the entire world and collect it all in one database and create a geospatial base map. At that point, open data really wasn't a very big part of the landscape. This was pre-Google Maps. Ordnance Survey was still pretty very locked down. So it was really important for all sorts of reasons, from people who were trying to make maps for walking through the countryside, for canals, for people who were excited about train networks. And from that seed, our techniques and the people who are involved have grown to now 50,000 people contribute every month. Big companies, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and others are using OpenStreetMap as a primary source of data in their products. It's a big part of humanitarian response, which I'll get into in a bit. It's probably the largest open geospatial data set in the world, and it's all created by people who are voluntarily contributing data. And early on, we had the idea of intersecting what is pretty honestly a crazy idea with humanitarian response, and trying to make a connection between this kind of crowdsourcing community, very grassroots, with something which is very opposite. And so that was the seed of what became Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, because most of the world at that point, let's go back to like 2004, 2005, most of the world where some of the most serious natural disasters and otherwise were happening, there was not good geospatial data sets available readily for what is very complex responses. So with OpenStreetMap, it became very easy to build those maps using not only GPS data collection, but digitizing satellite imagery and developing techniques to scale this approach to large numbers of people. We had to learn new vocabulary, and we had to also adapt our cultural practices. And so HOT, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, this interface between this very it's the network diagrams that we saw at the start. It's like if you mashed all of those together and then scrambled it up even more. It's a very complicated network, but HOT was there to try to be this interface. 2 examples just to give you an idea of what scale looks like. This is Livingstone, Zambia, and this is from a project that took place over the course of last year to map a half million square kilometers of areas of the world which are impacted by malaria, and to digitize every single structure from satellite imagery. So this is a large-scale effort which involved partners like Digital Globe, like the Gates Foundation, Clinton Health Access Initiative, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, Visualize No Malaria, which involves PATH and Tableau Foundation and Mapbox. And this is just one city, obviously, but over the course of a year, 5 million buildings were digitized over that 500,000 square kilometers by almost 5,000 people. And what buildings are important for is they help, they're key input to models of predicting where malaria is going to happen, along with previous patterns of incidents and previous health records, anticipated weather events, and of course, buildings are a proxy for where people are. It's also helpful for interventions like spraying campaigns. If you are going to stop malaria from spreading, you need to spray inside a high percentage of buildings in each geography and make sure that you get comprehensive coverage. So you have to know where all the buildings are. So that this global effort, which involved people from, within companies running mapathons to people on the ground, to people who just wanted to help, 5,000 people were contributing something which became very, very valuable and open, and also open for other uses. So this data set still exists. It's not just for malaria, it's not just for humanitarian use, it's for whatever, for perhaps delivering packages, for addressing all sorts of needs in Livingston and elsewhere. So that's big scale, also intersecting with small scale. The other example is from rural Kenya. The folks who are trudging through that stream are government officials from county government in rural Kenya, bravely visiting all projects which have been funded through a participatory budgeting process, and going and collecting the location and lots of metadata about the status of that project and its impact, because while they are very good at engaging community to portion out to fund various things, they were not very good at the monitoring and evaluation because there weren't systems. And so the idea here was to actually utilize all the same tools that are involved in data collection in OpenStreetMap, collect those locations, collect all of that metadata, bring it into OpenStreetMap, and build tools like this to give this overview of what's happening there. And this was an intersection of work with this Kenyan government funded by the World Bank, and the trainers, the people who actually brought the expertise in OpenStreetMap, came from a project called Map Kibera. Kibera is a slum in Nairobi, Kenya, and I've been involved with this project for many years to map the slums in OpenStreetMap, and they are from these places as well. So that's almost 10 years ago. The young people who were just learning OpenStreetMap 10 years ago are now in the slums, are now teaching folks who are county officials to do the same so that they can track work in their part of Kenya. So just 2 examples to chew on. That's all from me. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Jennifer Shirk, who's the Interim Executive Director for the Citizen Science Association.
Thanks, Allison, and thank you, all of you, for coming, and everyone who's listening, tuning in online. I'm going to take things in a slightly different direction from scale in terms of citizen science projects, although I do want to start with thinking about and illustrating a project just as an analogy for where I'm going to go. Because scale and thinking about scale really opens up a lot of questions about tensions and synergies. A lot of questions about maximizing efficiencies. And in the case of citizen science, finding ways that we can work together to really maximize who does what well and bring those skills together to have the greatest impact. And so just for an example and as an analogy, so I'm based technically at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, have been for over 10 years, where I first started working on building out best practices for the field of citizen science and now do that work through the Citizen Science Association. So I'm giving you a bird example here. If we think about things in terms of tensions, how can we have and maximize citizen science that does both of these things well? There seems like there's a tension between the best practices of citizen science that say have the greatest, most personal impact, deeply meaningful experiences by getting outside and getting engaged with science and with the world around you. And at the same time, generate massive data sets and bring together the knowledge necessary to do spatial temporal modeling with these gigantic, messy data sets. Each of those things is possible and does happen through citizen science, but it's because we're recognizing things that are synergies rather than tensions. Maximizing partnerships to bring together the data and working with people on the ground who can really do the best education and people globally who can do the best data integration and analysis. And the same things are questions that come up when we think about the field of citizen science writ large. So tensions, synergies, best practices, maximizing efficiency by working in partnership across scales. And so here I want to turn instead to thinking about how we do this same kind of thing related to generating and sharing and compiling those best practices for how we do citizen science itself. And again, this is the work that I do through the Citizen Science Association, although my work is really in helping people find best practices. Although in 2007, I was part of work at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology to hold the first conference on best practices. About 60 people got together in Ithaca, came out with a guide, a website, and a movement that has ultimately led to the Citizen Science Association. I'm no longer really doing the work of generating best practices because that work is done by everybody, for the most part, on this panel, in this room, and around the world who are leading and advancing the work of citizen science. So how do we maximize those synergies to find and point to and connect those best practices and do it at different scales? And two examples that are really close to the community that's convening us here in the federal government. A number of years ago, of course, put together the toolkit for citizen science on citizenscience.gov, and most recently, the Forest Service has come out with a toolkit as well. And here are some things that I want us to think about across scale and maximizing efficiencies and working to connect knowledge at the appropriate scale. These are not the only toolkits out there. There are other organizations, other agencies who are generating toolkits. If each of us set out to generate a toolkit, we're covering a lot of the same ground. But do we have to? Are there ways that we can find a centralized place to host a core of knowledge and at the same time help people find the depth of knowledge about citizen science practices that are most relevant to them in their community, such as in agencies in the federal government, in a particular agency in the federal government, and be able to scale that knowledge from the general to the specific about these best practices. At the same time, can we also scale up how the sharing of that knowledge happens from a very specific case, such as within the Forest Service, and help elevate and share things that are transferable to other communities of practice, such as, for example, I was just on a webinar about this this toolkit a few weeks ago and learned that there's a whole document describing different terms for citizen science and how they're used. And that's on a Forest Service website, but could have relevance to people in many different places and contexts. And so how do we help people find that knowledge? This is work that's really underway. It's a very open conversation. I'd really invite us to all take the opportunity to think about this together while we're here, the knowledge we have, the spaces we have to share it in. And where I'm most interested in thinking and sharing and advancing conversations about this is also how the Citizen Science Association can play a role in that process. As an organization that looks to engage and foster and create spaces for that sharing to happen, what is it that we can do to connect conversations across scales? Hosting affinity groups, for example, helping people find the networks if they come to the Citizen Science Association first, helping them recognize that there's a whole depth of knowledge in water quality monitoring, for example, if that's where their interests lie, or in K-12 education or environmental justice. One space where we're physically doing this together is in Raleigh in March. We have a conference at SCI 2019. Talk about scale. There will be about 800 people there together, many of the folks in this room, and really looking forward to conversations that help connect people, not just across different scales, but across different disciplines and across different communities, with an eye towards sharing those best practices that will help us all maximize our efficiencies as we approach even how we learn to do citizen science better so that we can do this work with integrity for both science and public engagement. So again, a very different take on scales, but hopefully one that helps us think about that transfer of knowledge, not within citizen science, but for citizen science. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Excellent start to this discussion. So what I thought we would do is I think I'll ask one question and then we'll move pretty quickly to any questions that you all have, as well as questions coming in through Menti and through Twitter. So please feel free to think about your questions as well as submit them through those platforms. But verbally is also totally fine. So just a quick question to get us going. Actually, maybe it's not so quick, but I'm curious to hear from each of you a little bit about the thought process, the sort of strategic thinking, et cetera, that went into your decisions with whatever projects or programs you'd like to talk about what scale to operate at. And then in addition to that, any thoughts that you have about the present or future? Are there questions about scale that you're currently grappling with? Or is there a future state that you're interested in moving towards in terms of scale? And how do you think through some of those questions? Feel free to jump in if you have something to get us going.
Yeah, I can just jump in with a really short one. Develop and test globally, develop and test locally, deploy globally in partnership with multiple organizations who can provide critical feedback.
So is that sort of what you were thinking in the past? And then does that translate again to how you're thinking about the future as well? Okay, excellent.
So with Globe, it was always envisioned that we would be global. So that was always what we are.
It's in the name, right?
Right. And the question was how to figure out how to make that happen and have all of the individual countries and whatever to be able to do what they needed to do. And so for the future, we continue to want to add more countries, and we're working on that. Excellent.
When we first started OpenStreetMap, was very much a decentralized model, very much modeled on open source projects. with the idea of there's enough space for everyone to do their thing within one database. That was the original idea that we brought to working on humanitarian response, and that we had to adapt. If you are going into the field post-disaster or in a challenging environment, or you're working with a big partner, we, as an organization, and we only formalized in 2010 after existing as an idea for 5 years and then being part of the Haiti response in 2010, we struggled with that transition from a very decentralized model to one where at least one pocket of the OpenStreetMap world, in some of its work, needed to have a more structured and formulated response. And I think HOT has transitioned well, though still I think the struggle has been to retain in a consistent way the vibrancy of that organic growth to start. The project overall, OpenStreetMap is, I would say as of 2018, is a victim of its own success in that the model of everyone jumping in and doing their thing, and as long as you're making good map data, it'll all work out. We're now so successful and so large, and especially you have fairly major companies working in the same space as people who are mapping their own neighborhoods. We are, I think, of a need of more structure and more governance, but it's a struggle when you're coming from the essence and the motivation of the open source world and of personal volunteerism. Going through, I do not know what we're going to look like on the other end of this process, but it's something this very week that we are very vigorously discussing on the internet.
I'll say that there's a scale of gatherings that certainly happened over time for citizen science, with a conference this coming March that will have at least 800 people. It's a very different experience than some of the early conferences that had been held, which were maybe 60. And so as we think as an association about how to provide the most meaningful experiences to connect, there's a lot of power in coming to a conference where there are 800 people and a breadth of learning that is possible. But also recognizing that it's worthwhile fostering connections maybe closer to home and more frequently for people than our biennial conference. And so moving forward, we're going to do, in addition to our every other year conference, working to support regional events and also connecting with people at disciplinary conferences for that closer and more honed in focus on topic and on place.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I'd like to move to some audience questions and some Twitter or Menti questions. And I thought I'd start by calling quickly on Julia Kumari-Drapkin, who's here today, and from the project I See Change. And I think it has another really interesting take on scale. So any comments, or perhaps the first question? Is there a microphone? Just wait for the microphone for a sec. Sorry.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you for asking. So I'm Julia Kumari-Drapkin from I See Change, and we have been grappling with scale from the very get-go because I See Change actually started out of a conversation with OSTP.
Oh, wow.
Bizarrely. Yeah. Well, I'm as a climate science reporter living here in DC, and, we were talking, and, I was like, come on, what's the holdup, John Holdren team? What's going on with adaptation? And they said, well, we can't go to congressmen or congresswomen and saying this is how much climate change impacts your district. And that scaling down from global time and space into individual stories and individual places was a moment where I said, oh, I have the same problem. I'm a climate reporter. I can't get Americans to care about climate change if I can't drill down into individual experiences. So we decided to re-engineer this, to kind of do the bottom-up crowdsourcing of climate change impacts and see what happened. And the most amazing stuff started to happen. Ecological forecasting, revelations on climate change communication paradigms. Now we're doing structured data as well. And so we launched locally in a small town and was enormously successful. We had people all around the world using us. Jeff, your story, very resonant with ours. And then when we scaled up with NASA, we had suddenly people all around the world using us, but we missed impact, right? we couldn't move the lever. And that was so much embedded in our social values and mission that we started launching local pilots to figure out specific things that communities cared about. Our first one was on urban heat in Harlem with sensors, and we blew our mind on that one. And then we did another one that was really successful in New Orleans around flooding with the Thriving Earth Exchange as a partner. And both of those successes we've launched structurally to the global platform. So we're doing the global and local development actually within our system and working with AI is our next big challenge. MIT gave us a small grant for the AI for the betterment of humanity, which is humbling and terrifying and awesome. And always we're looking for partners on that. In terms of questions, I really have to kind of zoom in on Mikkel. Thank you, first of all, for OpenStreetMap. It's amazing. And I think that birthing OpenStreetMap is born of this open data, open source movement, and your structural kind of challenges are very interesting to me because we have actually backed away from open data because our community has taught us that that data matters and that there's impacts around that data. And I think that that's a struggle that the citizen science as a movement hasn't really dealt with well, because data is powerful and also in both ways, for the good of humanity and the not so good. So do you have advice for the rest of the movement around that idea?
I think there's with pretty much, I mean, you can see it with even this week with the the New York Times article on location tracking and issues around privacy. These are very complicated topics to grapple with what data we contribute and how it can be used, and there's a lot of like detail and fidelity, I think, and specificity, which is very hard to get into a headline. I think training and education and some of the basic concepts around data, its potential impacts, how to evaluate it not in a yes or no way, but in like a graduated way is really important. I've seen this in my work, especially to go back to Kibera. We worked with the community to say, well, what is actually legitimate to map? And we're only talking about public facilities, the kinds of things that you would see in Google Maps, but even then there are sensitive features. In Kibera, there are community pharmacists. So through some way, people who are not licensed to prescribe medications get a hold of medications and make them available in the community. This is a problem, but it's also a very complicated issue for the community, and so there was a very deliberate choice to not include those in OpenStreetMap. We've done a lot of work in the education sector, and schools which were not informal schools, which are not licensed within the Ministry of Education, had a lot of concern about revealing where they were, with the idea that the Ministry of Education would then try to shut them down. MapKibera did a lot of work to show how that data actually would be used by the Ministry of Education, and that there was not an intention to shut them down, but actually to see how they could better support those schools. It took a lot of relationship building, a lot of time spent in a lot of administrators' offices, and a lot of explanation about exactly where that data was going to go and what it would going to do before schools would be comfortable sharing that data openly in a way that the ministry would see. So it's very case by case, and a lot of it comes down to educating just about these basic concepts around how data work, and it takes a lot of effort.
Any other responses or comments on this thread? Excellent. Are there other questions in the audience using voices?
Hi, my name is Natalie Alm. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Andes Amazon program, and a couple of you have touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious if you could expand a little more on, when thinking about implementing these projects, sort of from the first conceptualization all the way through implementation and trying to get users and get communities involved at a global scale, non-US or non-Western audiences, and kind of the challenges of working across cultures and languages to, implement these things. The idea is to have these kind of streamlined technologies, but sometimes, these things kind of put a wrinkle in that. So I'm curious, some recommendations or best practices when kind of thinking about that very diverse audience.
Well, throughout the GLOW program, we have always sought input from the users to understand what they needed, and we do work across many different levels of technology. So when we began the program, it wasn't just submit the data through the web. We enabled it to be submitted through email. We tried to find ways to accommodate. With our website, we do have a version for those who don't have a very high bandwidth. So we continue to try to understand through these regional meetings, through these working groups, to find out what the challenges are, and then we try to address them. We also do have our materials translated into the 6 UN languages, but many more that our partners have translated. So that's very important.
Yeah, we've kind of broken it down into 3 elements: content, presentation through the app, UI, UX, and communication. And on the content side, because we wanted to go global, really trying to identify those things that would provide value to a wide range of users, because we didn't know who was going to pick up on it. Communication, or presentation through the app, really focusing, and I think we looked to a number of successful examples in this room, Globe, eBird, etc. But having a graphic artist engaged early and often, and using line drawings rather than photos to communicate whatever it is that you're trying to get people to do in your tool. And finally, the communication, and we all like to think of ourselves as reasonably good communicators, or we wouldn't have accepted this invitation to sit up on a panel. But the reality is, we can never communicate with these diverse stakeholders as well as somebody who's a member of those stakeholders is. And I think Globe has talked about how you've handled that. You guys have done a phenomenal job with OpenStreetMap with that. You've been promoting that concept. But I think it bears repeating that just the partnering is huge. And we intentionally did not ask USAID, which was the initial funding, for a large implementation budget. We said, we're going to put it on ourselves to develop a product that people will be willing to take up and adopt and promote themselves. And if we don't, we're going to give you back your money at year 2 or 3. And we were kind of on the verge of that, because uptake, as you saw in that curve, it took a while to go. But I think those 3 elements.
Great. I wanted to follow up on a thread that Jennifer started us down about thinking about how to host a core of knowledge as well as allow for the depth of knowledge in a variety of different contexts, and to hear responses on that theme. And I think I saw a question on that theme. Is it possible to pull back that screen back up? Well, let's just respond to that. Do you all have thoughts on how to balance those complementary goals?
Could you say the question?
Sure. Sorry, distracted us. So the sort of potential trade-off between hosting like a core of knowledge that's a focus of the community, citizen science, crowdsourcing, all of these communities, as well as allow for a depth of knowledge in a variety of different contexts. So, whether to let 1,000 flowers bloom and let progress happen that way versus trying to coordinate and consolidate some of these best practices across where they might be relevant.
Yeah, as a whole, the project's taken very much a platform approach, both to the technology and the way we structure ourselves as a community, and that there's a minimum at the center in which you're sort of buying into as a vision, or if you're building applications against the OpenStreetMap API or with OpenStreetMap data, there's a limited number of things you need to follow technically, but you're very welcome to, at the very start, the idea was to fulfill a lot of different needs. So it's part of the design, and at the same time, there's there's pockets where there's attempts to like bring different streams of work together. That, that becomes very hard as well. There's one example recently of work on the ID editor, which is the main web-based editor for editing spatial data in OpenStreetMap. And you get, in open source, you get lots of different forks sometimes of people who do a lot of interesting work. But while they've been doing work over here, on the same time, the main line of the project's moved here, and so to get back to here can be very difficult. And so that's the place where I'm trying to like focus on and invest if we do have resources to bring. And I'm not talking necessarily as the OpenStreetMap Foundation or even as HOT, but just there's various different organizations within the community, is like making sure that we identify where those opportunities are to loop together. And that's a key investment, because it doesn't happen naturally, organically necessarily. It does just, things just bloom and spoke out.
Well, I think because it is locally driven, the knowledge of how it's implemented and the results are there in the local communities, the national and regional. We do have mechanisms for us to gather that globally and share that. There are a list of peer-reviewed publications that have been done on Globe. But again, because it is, the implementation is at the local level, that is really where that is. We do encourage the sharing. Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
I think through the Citizen Science Association, this is such an emergent field that those 1,000 flowers will bloom, and they must bloom. That's what's going to build innovation. What we want to do is make sure that they don't have to bloom over and over and over again. So how do we build those crosswalks? Mm-hmm. How do we provide that structure so people aren't reinventing the wheel? They can find the technologies that they need, the innovations that they need, the communities that will help them deepen and grow their work. And so providing the spaces is something itself that needs to emerge. So really looking forward to conversations as we grow the Citizen Science Association to make that happen.
Excellent. We're actually a little bit over time, so we will wrap it up there and continue the conversation with everyone with the upcoming interactive session.
All right, is everybody having fun yet? Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday afternoon. John McLaughlin from citizenscience.gov. And here is Sophia.
Hi, I'm Sophia Bilou. I work at the U.S. Geological Survey, and I also co-chair the federal community practice here.
And we want you to take out your portable electronic devices or your laptops, because we want you to use menti.com again. We want to try doing some crowdsourcing with you. So, first question. How are you feeling? Okay, happy's winning out over tired. Tired's catching up. Yeah.
Sorry, so in case you don't know, the code is 496945. 496945.
Yep, so to vote, go to menti.com and enter that code.
I'm glad no one's sick, yes.
Yeah. All right, I think Happy has it, so yay, happy group. All right, so let's talk about which project you're from. Okay, you're from No Projects. What is the name of the project that you manage or participate in, the project you most identify with? And so we have quite a few projects represented. I'm liking seeing none. Preaching to the choir is not something we really want to do. So we actually want people who are not from citizen science projects here learning. So thank you for coming and your interest in the field. On Earth Challenge 2020, Size Starter, Globe.
I'm kind of curious, what's Crowd the Tap? Anyone? Oh, yes, that's right. Oh, great. And there's Disc Detective, Alberta Aurora Chasers, Bio Blitzes. There are many that have been going on across various national parks.
So after this interactive section, we'll be going to break. So those of you who wrote none, who want to learn about projects, are the people from these projects.
I definitely would be interested to know Flew Near Me, Flew Near You. Chesapeake Bay Parasite Project. Great. SitSci for the Amazon. These are some that I don't know.
Nobody was 6, so we can enter 0 for Flew Near You. All right, iNaturalist is coming up strong. Right. Move on to the next one.
Yes.
Oh. Okay, now not necessarily which project, but your host institution. What are you? Government, academia, other? Federal trust and instrumentality, of course. Yep. How did we not have that with Wilson Center as our co-host? All right.
Yeah, for anyone who did put other, what would other be for you?
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. AAAS Fellows. Absolutely.
We're a pretty diverse pie here. This is nice. It's great to see so many different organizations. One thing we found in the federal world is almost all of our projects happen through partnership. There are very few projects that we do alone in-house. So a diverse type of institutions is really essential for successful citizen science and crowdsourcing. All right, it's nice to know a little more about who's here. Moving on to the next question. Okay. So moving on to the next question. What scale is the project you're involved with most work at? Global, local, regional? Wow, what an evenly based chart so far. Yeah. Global in the slight lead. This is awesome. If we want to share across scales, we're going to have a lot of opportunities today. Ooh, local and global are neck and neck. Yeah. Wow. Well, we could not ask for better balance. So thank you all from so many different scales for attending today. All right. Going to move us on to the next question. All right. We're talking about working collaboratively across scales. Do you? One brave person. All right, somebody else to join on the lonely island. Yeah. Well, we have some people who are not associated with projects, so we wanted to make sure there was an answer for everybody. So yeah, the not applicable probably maps to that none in the word cloud. Well, it looks like we have a lot of experts in this topic of sharing across scales here today. Right. Now, we want you to draw from what you've heard in the panel as well as from your personal experiences and answer about what are some of the best ways to facilitate collaboration across scales. And by the way, if you want to turn to the person next to you and talk to them too, that's certainly allowable. So you can draw from your the panel, your personal experiences, or the experiences of the people next to you. I love
Free food.
Here to learn about this. Yeah.
So we will have free food later. Some, well,
Yeah.
chocolate that I made. Some drinks, I'm pretty sure, from the Wilson Center.
Yeah. Technologies for connection. Great to see. Love partnerships and love that there's an exclamation point after it. Thank you. Empathy. That's a great answer. Yeah. Hearing mutual respect and listening. Was the person who entered happy hour the same person who entered pizza and beer in the previous question?
Innovation labs. There's definitely a good handful of them around here. Heat. Is it really cold? I had thought about putting a question of how's the room temperature? Sometimes that's good.
Okay. Well, apologies. We don't want to increase the sick answer to the first question. So
I think there's an interesting balance of the need for how you can facilitate communication. So there's, definitely face-to-face is really important, but things like Google Hangouts. Listen.
All right. Oh, we have a collaborative and food-centric group here. This is interesting. Well, thank you all for the entertaining and really thoughtful answers. This is great to see.
Over 100, almost 100. Someone else add something. Oh, yes, thank 100. You. 101.
Yeah.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Yeah, I think it's really important to kind of explore how do we communicate in different ways? How do we, collaborate in different scales, especially when we all can't be in person in the same location. And so I think technology and emerging social technologies have really enabled this in new ways.
All right. Yep. Moving on to the next one. We've talked about best practices to share, but what are some of the challenges to sharing across scales? Yeah, we heard communication as a best practice, so lack of communication makes sense as a challenge. Yeah. Clearly, funding and language and communication. Yeah.
I'm impressed someone got a graphic in there. Is that a graphic? Yeah. Nice. A little emoji.
Yeah. Personal bandwidth. Yeah, I think a lot of us might feel that sometimes.
I think culture is really key. Yeah, I think we all have different cultures. It could be different disciplines. It could be, typical, ethnic cultures, or it could be a variety of other levels that I don't think we always realize. It's important to connecting.
So time and money and communication are coming across, I think, so far as three pretty clear themes. Time zones. We were actually just talking about the clock behind us that is on a different time zone. So we hear that. Institutional racism and pride. Those are definitely challenges.
Now, one note about time zones that I think is pretty fascinating, maybe Mikkel might be able to speak to some of this, is in the crisis mapping world, or just in emergency management and leveraging crowdsourcing, it's actually really valuable to leverage the variety of time zones, because then you can actually have a 24/7 set of operations from digital volunteers around the world, leveraging those who are still awake and in their daytime, and then leverage the folks in another time zone for their daytime. And so it's a great way to scale in a short period of time. But it can be a challenge if you're all trying to chat with each other in a different time zones.
Yeah, so we had different technologies as best practices, and here we see as a challenge. Some people don't have access to those technologies. All right, well, thank you all for a wealth of challenges. So now coming back to our federal community practice, how can federal agencies potentially help with some of these challenges so we can facilitate sharing by helping some of the other institutions in this group get over? So funding potentially? Yeah. So I see NPS BioBlitzes is appearing quite often, so let's focus on that. So I think we set ourselves up for that one. That is I'd like to set an example. But really what we do as an example is work in partnership with the outstanding groups that have so much of the content knowledge for how to do this. Also seeing this theme of open data and data hubs and resource centers.
Now, interoperability and standards, I think that's an important one because there's a growing need to share data, and we're all collecting these kinds of data from various platforms. And I think there's true value in trying to make citizen science and crowdsourcing data available in a variety of places, or maybe in one place. What we do in the federal government, we have data.gov as one attempt to doing that. But how do we leverage this data and share it in a way where it can be interoperable? And so I think that is a challenge that we are dealing with in various ways.
So for best practices, we had communication come across strongly. And in challenges, we had a lot of challenges related to communication. We had language and such. And I'm also seeing communicating here, being a convener and such. So thank you all for joining us for this conversation and using Menti with us, trying this platform out to help us work on how we can communicate both people in the room and people virtually. And so would like to thank all of you for bearing with us and trying out a new technology, and want to really thank Sophia for all she did to make this possible.
Thank you for trying it.
And so we're going to move on to a project that's all about collaboration. And Alex and Liz will present on Earth Challenge 2020.
Yeah. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Alex Long from the Science and Technology Innovation Program.
And I'm Liz Newberry, also from the Science and Technology Innovation Program here at the Wilson Center.
All right, so we are going to just do a quick little presentation on Earth Challenge 2020, which some of you may have heard of, but basically it is a celebration of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which will be in April of 2020. And we at the Wilson Center are very excited to be partnering with Earth Day Network and the State Department as the three main collaborators on the project with many other partners. And as you may have noticed, we have a video which will play right now with a very cool person speaking. So
this is the inaugural launch of this video.
Also
true. Any feedback would be great.
Yes, welcome to a movie premiere.
Yes.
Earth Day became the largest people's protest in the history of the world. And we changed the world for the better by creating clean air and clean water laws with the help of scientists and policy leaders, the people's movement that couldn't be stopped. Today's environmental threats of extreme climate change and pollution to our air and water can feel overwhelming. But fortunately, we're developing the world's most accessible and transparent citizen science database portal ever created. It's called Earth Challenge 2020, and it will allow everyone and anyone to help document the environmental conditions of their community and provide critical information on the threats and the opportunities to make our cities and neighborhoods healthier for people and for all living things. Join us and be a part of the solution. Learn more at earthday.org.
Try. So as Alex mentioned, the Earth Challenge 2020 is a collaboration between the Wilson Center, Earth Day Network, and the State Department. And part of the goal is to engage millions of global citizens to gather 1 billion points of data across the world. It's going to be spoiler alert, as the video mentioned, in a celebration of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So in April 2020, that's going to be when our big data push is. Right now, we're in the stage of collecting research questions. After the research questions, which is a crowdsourcing endeavor that we're trying to lead here, we'll be having a series of hackathons around the globe. And after that, then once the database servers and all that great technology is all lined up for us, we're going to be having outreach around the citizen science data collection. So what do we want you to do? And I don't want to keep you from your break too much, but if you could take just a moment to go to Twitter or to the Earth Day website under campaigns, you'll be able to find Earth Challenge 2020. Or literally, it's right behind me. I'm sorry. Technology. The big themes that we've identified as a collaboration are around human health, pollution, air and water quality, ocean plastics, climate change. Those are all coming also out of our outreach efforts. What are you interested in? What are you working on? And those sorts of things. And I will just shut up now since we are getting questions arising. Okay. Menti. We're going to use all of the technologies today. Menti, Twitters at Earth_challenge, or the Earth Day website. Obviously, we are here and we're using Menti, but after this, you're sitting in your car, you're in the elevator, and you're like, oh my goodness, I wish I had asked that question. That's where you can go.
And if you want to, I guess this is a plug, but if you want to follow Wilson Stipp on Twitter, you'll also see us tweeting about this for, honestly, the foreseeable future. But the research questions, just right now, we've done a lot of pushes. So you can find all the information on our Twitter or on Earth Day Network's Twitter, and then also the Earth Challenge Twitter. All right, nice.
How do planet stars form? Yeah. Yes. We don't feel ourselves limited to one question, but instead what we're trying to get is an impression of how we can steer these various citizen science initiatives from our perspective. We're trying to work from both existing citizen science work, so existing citizen science orgs, and try to amplify work that's already being done by citizen science existing projects, as well as help potentially foster future projects around the globe. Can we go to the, there's a second slide?
Yes, there's a second one. Oh, yeah. Cool. Okay, yeah, so then now we're asking more specifically towards our project, what do you think that we should hone in on based on what you know in the space and what you want to see citizen science, maybe something new or maybe something that needs more support? Yeah, it's interesting. So we've done a push and we've gotten a lot of responses in this past month. And I would probably say that food security is something that we didn't necessarily expect to see. We've been seeing a lot more of. And that's pretty exciting because when investigating that more, I think that citizen science can make a really great impact there as well.
Yeah, we've seen a wealth of wonderful, engaging questions from all around the globe. We even had a question come in from Antarctica. I'm trying to work on the space station, so if anyone from NASA could help us with that, I'm just kidding. But
well, Mars.
Oh, Mars.
Look at the rover.
Yeah, could the rover tweet in it?
Other interesting ones that we've seen come in are clean energy, which I also think citizen science can play a much larger role in.
And part of the goal of this project is to be a force to raise both local action as well and education around science and citizen science, and drive, like we said, existing projects. But hopefully we want new people involved in citizen science as a result of this effort. I would love if somebody who's putting up behavioral change in those sorts of actions, if you could drill down just a little bit more, like what sort of behavioral change you're interested in. But that's just also my personal bias.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to leave this up, and you guys can keep answering the questions. I think that the coffee break should start in about 2.5 minutes. So you can keep responding, but I would also encourage you definitely to go on Twitter, and as you think over the coffee break or over the course of the day, if you want to get more engaged with the project, you can tweet us like Liz has already mentioned, or you can actually engage with us and ask questions to see more about the Earth Challenge 2020 project if you have follow-up questions concerning our actions and what we're doing, because we're here to collaborate.
Yep. Thank you guys so much.